So we're looking at the state of opposition and especially the fate of the right. For those who don't know us, this is a Radix Big Tent webinar. Radix Big Tent is think tank of the Radical Centre. Big Tent, that clumsy name that we have, is the merger of two organisations, Big Tent being the space for those outside the political mainstream to have conversations and contribute to the political debate. Thank you to those that have submitted questions in advance. I'll do my best to bring in as many of those as we can. Somebody did say to me, wouldn't it be a lot easier to have this discussion in a week's time when we actually know the result of the election? But it seemed to me there's not much fun doing it when you know the result. It's much more fun to speculate. And we've got the best two people we could possibly have doing that for us. Tim Bale is Professor of Politics at Queen Mary's College, author of the Conservative Party After Brexit, leading political scientist, and most important of all, a Radix Fellow, and we are delighted to have him with us. And then Daniel Lord Finkelstein, a former advisor to any number of party leaders, so John Major, William Hague, David Owen, both bits may be relevant, chief leader writer from the Times, former chief leader writer of the Times, executive editor of the Times, now regular columnist. Indeed, he's had pretty much every job that I've ever aspired to have and never had. Guys, it's really, really good to have you. And I mean, let's just kick off with, what do you expect in the terms of the Conservative campaign today to wake up to on the 5th of July? Tim, why don't you go for that?
Well, in as much as I will get any sleep, I guess I have to go with the findings of most of the opinion polls, though, of course, as we know, they're snapshots, not predictions. It would be very hard to believe that they were all wrong and all wrong in the same direction. So I think, like most other people, I would expect to wake up to a pretty significant defeat for the Conservative Party. Whether that defeat will extend to it going below 100 seats, I must admit I have my doubts. But let's just say I would expect a fairly comfortable Labour majority and a very uncomfortable defeat for the Conservatives. And then I guess I would expect to start hearing very, very quickly about a Conservative leadership contest.
I've got myself muted in the process. Danny, does that attune with what you are expecting?
Yes, it does. I mean, I think it's really quite possible the Conservatives will go below 100 seats. Right at the beginning of the campaign, I was going through the three campaigns you can run. It's time for a change. It's better the devil you know, and Britain's on the right track. Don't turn back. And Conservatives couldn't run any of those. If you look at any fundamentals in the campaign, ranging from economics to leadership, or you take measures of long-term party health, which are demographic coalitions, all of them point to a terrible result, and that's what's going to happen. Yeah, I'm expecting a terrible result. I also think the other thing that I think if the polls will surprise in two, the sort of exit poll will surprise in two ways. I think, first of all, the Liberal Democrats will do better than people have registered they're going to do. The strategy of the Liberal Democrats, which is basically to become the Labour Party wherever you are, which is what it's done, has been very successful, and people will vote Labour for them. Then for the, I also think the Reform Party will win more seats than people think. And the reason I think that is I think their vote's more concentrated, has a sort of thicker demographic base, and has a lot of turnout enthusiasm, as some of their campaign events demonstrated. So I think those are the two ways on the night people will look at those figures and think, gosh, that's a bit more than I'd expected.
I mean, that might be offset perhaps by the lack of a ground campaign, I guess, for Reform. Or does that not concern you?
I think it might be. First of all, they might have some ground campaign. But I also think while the ground campaign might matter for them in a couple of places where they might otherwise win, enthusiasm will see them win in other places. But look, these are speculations, so you don't know.
Yeah, I should say as well. I mean, although I, research and write about party membership, actually you can overstate the extent to which the ground campaign makes a great deal of difference. I mean, if you look at the Conservative win in 2019, actually, when we surveyed party members, Conservative members were far less likely to have done anything for the party than Labour members, for example. But much difference did it make. I think the only thing I would add to that, I don't know what Danny thinks about this one, is I wonder whether a low turnout, which I would expect, might impact a little bit on Labour's vote and therefore the number of seats they get. But that's the only kind of variable I can see making that much of a difference.
Well, I think a big determinant of whether the Conservative Party gets more than 100 seats is its own turnout, actually. So I would expect if there was sort of general sense of who cares who wins, the Conservative Party might be more the victim of that than Labour, where there's at least this let's get the Tories out feeling. It's hard to see what it is that propels Tories to the ballot box.
So just thinking about that, then, I mean, you're both sort of either side of 100 somewhere along the line. Who does it leave? I mean, this is probably a question for you, Tim, in the first place. So trying to understand who's going to be left in that Conservative Party. What does it look like?
Yeah, I mean, we did a little bit of modelling, David Jeffrey and I from University of Liverpool some time ago, actually on the old boundaries. And of course, I don't think we assumed so many people would actually be quitting the Commons as early as they have, or in the kind of numbers that they have. And we suggested that actually the party wouldn't look so very different in terms of its ideological balance from the way it looks now. I've seen a couple of more up-to-date exercises done by other people, which probably suggest pretty much the same. I mean, it's tempting to think that a lot of the very kind of blue in tooth and claw, red wall Conservative MPs will be gone, and therefore, it will be all quote unquote moderates in there. I don't think that's the case. I mean, I guess I would point people to the fact, however, that I think the Conservative Party over the last few years has probably had a majority of moderate, more centrist Conservative MPs, but they've been a relatively silent majority compared to the vocal minority of more kind of populist radical right Conservative MPs. And I'm not sure that will change very much, partly because I think there is a tendency, and Danny might be able to speak to this more than I can, because obviously he's more familiar with them at Westminster. There's been a tendency among those people to keep their heads down, maybe for fear of their local associations, maybe for fear of getting beaten up in the Tory press for coming out too actively against the more kind of populist radical right element within the party. And of course, the vocal minority do tend to have support from the Conservative supporting press as well. So I think it will be quite difficult, I think, for even if there is that moderate majority, for it to prevent, if there is a leadership contest, quite quickly, a more right-wing candidate winning.
Yeah, look, I don't think that's wrong at all. So it's very interesting, and I've noted it a long time, that you would assume that the new candidates who would be chosen would all they would all be Leave supporters, they would all be Boris Johnson supporters or Liz Truss supporters, and they would all come, with quite a strong position on the kind of issue. But it turned out that wasn't the case at all, and they got selected in very similar ways to before, which is quite interesting. One of the few hopeful signs actually there is about the Conservative Party is that happened. I think that whatever the nature of the parliamentary party, the logic of it, which will be that the Conservative Party will have been split in half, and therefore the Conservative Party has to set about reuniting the right, because otherwise it cannot possibly win. That will be incredibly strong, even to those people who are on the moderate wing of the party. I would argue very strongly that people have split in both directions because the Conservative Party failed to maintain the one most important moderate and centrist value of all, which is to be a competent, stable and reasonable government. And that everybody disliked, whether they went to Reform or went to the Liberal Democrats or went to Labour. Everybody disliked the incompetence of it. I would also argue that uniting with Reform voters isn't necessarily uniting the right. People who voted for the Reform Party are often, I mean, somebody came back here at the Times, where I'm sitting now, they came back from Sedgefield, having talked to a lot of electors and said, you know, every door he knocked on, he found a Reform supporter. And the truth is that was a safe Labour seat. And what he was knocking on were the doors of Labour voters who voted Conservative once or possibly twice after Brexit, but hadn't voted Conservative before in their lives. And in fact, it was very difficult to get them to vote Conservative. And those people are now voting Reform rather than going back to Labour, which is why Labour's relative scale of it's a bit wan. It's in terms of the number of percentage of vote that it's getting, and I think if the Conservative Party sees that as reuniting the right, it'll be making a big mistake. But I suspect it is a mistake it will make.
Yeah, I mean, I think those people might be right wing on, if you like, socio-cultural issues, but they're certainly not right wing on, you know, questions of the economy or public services, etc. And that does pose a bit of a problem for the coherence, I think, of the Conservative Party's message. I would agree. I mean, one thing that interests me about the Conservatives at the moment, and indeed some of the leadership contenders, and you can see this from Kemi Badenoch's interviews that she's been doing quite a few of, interestingly, over the last couple of days, is that they do seem so much more concerned with the threat on their right, as it were, than the losses to their centre. And I wonder if, you know, that's you know, rational, whether it's a mindset thing, and whether if it is a mindset thing, it's a mindset that they can get out of, because I think they will need eventually to get out of that. I mean, I realise in some ways that the imminent threat is Nigel Farage, and I realise, of course, that those leadership contenders, obviously Kemi Badenoch in particular, has got to appeal to a fairly right-wing grassroots Conservative Party, but it still does seem odd to me to be so concerned with you know, people floating off to Reform rather than the people floating off the other way.
Yeah, of course it is, and this has been a long-standing a particular argument. You know, my friend Andrew Cooper, the pollster, he talks about, and I'm thinking of writing about this tomorrow, but he talks about a long-standing realignment, which is because I think of the knowledge economy and globalization, we're moving towards an argument between open and closed. This was Tony Blair's phrase. And so the Conservative Party had always been the party of open, actually. It was internationalist, and you know, it was multilateralist, it was pro the EU, and it was for global markets, it was for the single market, and the Conservative Party has basically moved back to become the party of closed. I think in the long term, the party of open will defeat the party of closed more often than it loses to it. Occasionally it'll lose to it. And the only reason why this is not a total despair for the Conservatives is that nobody else has made their decision about how to respond to this split either. So the Reform Party is not a proper populist party of the Matthew Goodwin type. Although Matthew Goodwin is infuriating because of his politics, he's, I think, quite a good analyst. And he's right that there is a market for a populist party that's left on economics and right on social affairs. And Farage is not left on economics, so he's not a proper populist. The Liberal Democrats seem to me to take positions, sorry, I know this will probably annoy people, but it seems observably true. There doesn't seem to be any position you could take in the Liberal Democrats that you couldn't also hold and be in the shadow cabinet, even if sometimes the Labour Party doesn't favour those. So the Liberal Democrats haven't decided completely what they are either. And the Labour Party also hasn't made this decision. Do we want to be a progressive, but probably more free market orientated political party? probably Labour is closest to making that decision, which is why they're going to win the election by a massive majority. But whether or not they'll stick with that, or that will come unstuck in the argument. After all, it's only, short period since they were led by Corbyn. So there's, going to be quite a lot of arguing to be had about realignment, I think.
Yeah, I mean, where I would depart from Matt's analysis, and the analysis I think that is shared by a number of Conservatives as well, is in seeing that 2019 election as the realignment, as they often talk about it. They always use the definite article. They convince themselves in some way that there'd been this huge underlying shift of voters that wasn't necessarily contingent, didn't really depend so much on say enthusiasm for Boris Johnson or distaste for Jeremy Corbyn or wanting to get Brexit done, but represented an absolute watershed. And I'm just not sure that was ever true, because if we go back a little bit further, we have a Conservative Party that didn't really manage to win in 2010. It won quite cleverly in 2015, but only just by cannibalising, its Liberal Democrat partners. And I'm just not sure, for reasons we've already talked about, that the voters who flocked to the Conservative Party in 2019 were necessarily there for good, if you like. But it seems that so many Conservatives seem to have convinced themselves that that was the case, and that the key, in some senses, to the future of the party is actually locking in that realignment. But if that realignment never actually was as real as some of them think, then I'm not sure that is the future.
I'm going to leap in here, because it strikes me that I like Danny's analysis of none of the parties yet having worked out exactly which space they want to be in. We're just about to publish a blog by Vince Cable, and Vince is referring back to the 1924 election, which was really the point at which the old Liberal Party finally went into terminal decline and was reduced to 40 seats or so. And his argument is, are we actually at that switching moment? So, whichever party takes that space of the sort of open space on the right, if you think there is that space, is it inevitably the Conservative Party or something calling itself the Conservative Party? Or is it actually more likely that Reform takes that space, actually the Lib Dems tack back towards the sort of centre right? How terminal is what we're seeing now on this, at least, version of the Conservative Party? Is it possible they don't naturally come back?
Yeah, look, I think I think it's quite possible, yes, but that there is going to be, in the end, an economically conservative party. It's just a question of whether it will be the Conservative Party or not. I sort of think, as we drop out of this realignment, eventually they'll end up being a kind of more liberal international party and a more kind of nationalistic political party, probably. That's that probable way will go. And in those circumstances, probably would be a contest between a sort of populist Conservative Party and a more liberal Labour Party. That's probably what's going to happen. But it's not stuck. It's not stuck yet that is definitely the case, because these big choices have not been made. Labour hasn't made the choice that it wants to be that kind of party. And I know it sounds a bit rude, but and especially in the circumstance of the Liberal Democrats having a lot of MPs, but it's not obvious what exactly they're trying to do. That seems to me they're going to win loads of seats in order to stay out of the government they helped to form, which I just don't understand the logic of at all. But I don't know in this, we are a two-party system, so I don't know. I don't know where they're going to end up. I suppose it is possible that the Liberal Democrats end up taking over the Labour Party, as it were, taking over that space. But I can't. That is possible. Ultimately, that how that would happen. Reform takes a turn towards economic populism. and it begins to win Labour's heartland seats in the north, while the Liberal Democrats hold on to the tactical ones that you had in the south. And you end up with a Liberal Democrat versus Reform political system. It's not impossible.
It feels to me, actually, given the seats that the Lib Dems might end up winning, that they're more likely to become a substitute for the Conservative Party in the longer run. If you move into a position where they may be a more effective effective opposition than the Conservative Party, because the Conservative Party sort of turned in on itself, then more naturally they're going to be putting forward conservative-ish policies, but it might look like a sort of one nation Conservative Party rather than a certainly not the closed off anti.
Well, that's fine. You could end up in I can't see a situation in which the Liberal Democrats would be the kind of party of closed. Okay, and to the great credit of the Liberal Democrats, they've never dallied with that particular. They are that is, would be profound against the liberal spirit, and they're not going to be the party of closed. So the question is, who becomes the party of open? Obviously that was what I hoped the coalition between David and Nick Clegg would be, that has all broken down, obviously. So, but it looks like we're heading towards a situation where it would be, the natural party of government will be a party of open, uniting the centre between Liberal Democrats and Labour, and the party of close will be unite populist Conservatives with Reform. That seems quite a possible.
What do you think though about the possibility of some Conservative MPs actually looking at the Liberal Democrats and feeling that perhaps that's a more natural home for them should the Conservative Party, veer off towards a more kind of populist radical right, unite the right type settlement in the next Parliament or thereafter?
It's possible. It depends what, the Liberal Democrats have moved away from the position that made that attractive. Interestingly, in a situation which could happen, which we should think about, the Liberal Democrats would become the main party of opposition. They would then have a choice of doing what they do in the House of Lords, which is that they go always to the left of Labour, creating a lot of votes that even Labour decided they don't want to vote on. Or they could decide, well, look, we can push the Conservatives out and be, but they've got a lot of voters who are voting for them to be against the Tories. So the strategy they chose on was not equidistance. It was we are the Labour Party wherever you happen to live.
Except I guess that the logic of some of the seats, and I guess this comes back to Ben's suggestion, doesn't it? The logic of the seats that they might pick up might mean that actually they start paying attention to trying to hold on to those seats against Conservatives in some way, and therefore don't necessarily go to the left and actually stick more towards the kind of centre and centre right.
I think the Liberal Democrats are going to have this big opportunity caused by their leader's very successful election strategy, plus, by the way, just in parenthesis, amazing campaign strategy. Whoever did the photo strategy, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Because it's exactly what David wanted to be, which was strongly present without actually diverting anybody's attention from anything into anything that he might actually say, because that was all irrelevant to their strategy. And I think, and without, by the way, so as not to make that sound as though it's negative, without sacrificing anything in terms of his principles or only standing for things that he believes in. So very successful. And then you'll have a decision, as Liberal Democrats will have a decision to make about what they want to be as a political party in relation to the government. But I would argue, we have a two-party system, and the question is who's going to take this very broad position in the Conservative Party. So immediately after the last election, there was this feeling the Labour Party is going to be out forever 2 or 3 terms. Tories are in, and I never thought that. And the day after the general election, I wrote an article, appeared on Friday, the 13th of December, saying there are serious problems with the Conservative Party's victory because it's uniting a coalition, and there are bits of it can't manage. It cannot be both the party of small government and the party that tries to be govern Hartlepool, and it tries to do both those things. It'll crash.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I mean, I think the problem. Yeah, go on. I was going to say one more thing about the Lib Dems is that I mean, I think part of their problem is they look back and think, well, we did really well against New Labour when we were, anti the Iraq War, and we weren't trying to do the equidistance thing. We were to the left of the Labour Party, and then they look at what happened to them during the coalition when they got too close to the Conservative Party and then got smashed in 2015. And I think because of those two events, they have actually probably taken the wrong decision in terms of where to place themselves ideologically. And I think they would be better placing themselves slightly to the centre and slightly, if anything, to the right of the Labour Party in order to pick up, I think, some of the concerns among previous Conservative voters about the kind of social conservatism that is now being exhibited by the current Conservative Party. So I mean, I think Danny's absolutely right that they've succeeded in some ways recently by being slightly to the left of the Labour Party, or at least the Labour Party where you are, as he says. But I think in the future they have got a very big decision to make, and personally I think it would be better to place themselves to the slightly to the right of the Labour Party, and probably if in the unlikely, I still think, event that they become the official opposition, I guess that will be the natural thing to do.
Yeah, it'll look quite different, won't it? And that's Simon's point. And indeed, what then happens, let's just play with that a moment, because Simon Potter's asked a question. If the Lib Dems were to become the official opposition, where does that leave the Conservative Party at all? Is that the end of them?
Well, look, if unless you're going to assume that we are not in this going to have a considerable party of the kind of nationalist conservative disposition, then I don't believe it will be the end of a party of the right. Every country has a party of the right of some kind, and the way that I view it, is in 1924, Baldwin made this decision. He'd rather unite with, he'd rather face Labour than he would face the Liberals. There's a question about how much he was able to really make a choice. But anyway, he did prefer that. And the reason he preferred that was because the Labour Party was limited by its demographic and its ideology. And so he always thought they would sometimes win elections, but the natural party of government would be the Conservative Party. And that is exactly what's happened. What I think a party of closed would be a party that sometimes won elections, but wasn't the natural party of government. And that is what I think the Conservative Party will probably become. I don't think it would finish them off completely, because I think the Liberal Democrats don't quite know where to put themselves. And I don't know, you probably have a clearer idea than I would, Ben, about what would happen if they did become the party or main party of opposition.
My feeling actually is that the nature, you've got to look at the parties, the seats where the Liberal Democrats are in play. And if those seats are naturally conservative seats, actually the sort of conservative seat that you're describing, Danny, where they're open conservative seats, they're economically liberal and socially liberal seats, then the party will tack to fill that space. And that actually leaves even less space for a traditional Conservative Party. It does leave a lot of space for a right-wing, semi-populist party such as Reform. And I mean, are we therefore at the point where Farage has moved from sort of taking over the Conservative Party to destroying the Conservative Party? Is there any prospect now of Farage as leader of the Conservative Party?
Well, not in the immediate future. I mean, presuming we go into a leadership contest, even if he's in Parliament with a few MPs, I mean, he's not going to play any direct role in that. Although, of course, he may play an indirect role in the sense that there will be some contestants in that contest who talk about, as Suella Braverman has done, uniting the right. So he may be the kind of ghost at the feast there. I mean, I don't think it is entirely impossible to imagine, depending on who wins that contest, Nigel Farage and Reform being absorbed into the Conservative Party. I mean, I don't see the prospect of a reverse takeover whereby Reform swamps the Conservative Party. But I do think it might be tempting for some in the Conservative Party to try and absorb Reform, at which point, if he's still in Parliament and becomes a Conservative MP, imagine that the person who takes over from Rishi Sunak doesn't really get much traction against a Labour government, and there's another leadership contest. He would be eligible to stand, I guess. That would be the mechanism. And so I wouldn't entirely rule out Nigel Farage one day becoming the leader of the Conservative Party. It still seems to me quite unlikely, but I don't think it can be completely ruled out. But then, of course, that raises the question of how many people currently in Parliament in the Conservative Party, or at least after the election in Parliament in the Conservative Party, would be prepared to stay in a party led by either Nigel Farage or someone who was so desperate to outflank Nigel Farage that the Conservative Party, travelled even further than it has already in that populist radical right direction. That's when I think we might see some defections.
So I'd be willing to have a bet. And
unfashionable though that
not with you, but I've €5 for this. They're particularly suitable. There will be a split in the next Parliament over Nigel Farage's relationship with the Conservative Party, but it will not be in the Conservative Party. The split will be in Reform. The problem that Nigel Farage is going to have in this election is that he won't be the only Reform MP that gets elected. If there's even one more Reform person who gets elected, the party will split. And that's because the reason I'm saying that is with such a high degree of likelihood is because that has literally happened to Nigel Farage at every single stage of every iteration of every political party or organisation or effort that he's become involved in. So it just seems really unlikely that it won't happen again. Maybe he won't. He'll have learned from it. And Reform Brexit Party was certainly more organised than UKIP, and Reform is better organised than Brexit Party. But I certainly think that's a real possibility, and that Nigel Farage will be keener on his membership on being in the Conservative Party. That's probably part of his game than either the Conservative Party, but especially Reform. And I think that he will end up 2 or 3 years into the Parliament being a less strong figure than he is at the beginning of it, because his own party will begin to bicker with each other. One of the things the Conservative Party has found with the more it's involved itself with the eccentric parts of the right, the more ridiculous and undignified arguments it's had involved in. I've just been involved in the last few days in what might loosely be called the debate with Nadine Dorries, and it's just so deeply eccentric. You sort of, on the one hand, you think this person is an internet troll, and on the other hand, they're a former Secretary of State.
I mean, do you see any possibility, as she obviously does, and sorry to bring Nadine's views into it, of Boris Johnson, returning from the plough in order to rescue the party from Nigel Farage or whatever else is ailing it?
I think Nadine Dorries might be keener on that than Boris. Yes, I do think that's a real possibility. So the interesting question is raised: would Boris Johnson have done better in this general election than Rishi Sunak? And I think the answer almost certainly is yes. And the reason for that is that it probably would have prevented some of the leakage to Reform without Rishi Sunak having done considerably better with centrist Conservatives or potential voters from the centre. My point is that I wanted him to be removed as Prime Minister because he was unsuitable for that job. It was about the country rather than about the electoral prospects of the Conservative Party. And I still feel very passionately about that. But there's no point denying electoral realities. I think he probably would have done better. That will be very compelling. To me, it's not compelling because the purpose of a political party is to govern in a kind of sensible way. And I don't believe he's capable of doing that. He demonstrated that. But I think to others who are maybe either less fastidious or just don't see events in the same way that I do, that'll be very, very welcome. And he probably does combine kind of left-centre economics with nationalism in a way that can unite the centre to a party of closed, a kind of centrist populism. It's quite seductive. The problem is that he's so chaotic and would be terrible at the job.
So let me pick up a couple of the questions that we're getting and comments we're getting and chuck them in. Tom Everon is asking, what's a political strategy to look for the Conservatives to come back if they sort of finish in a very distant second place? Where should they be focusing their resources? And Mark Essex is sort of also saying, forget who's actually an MP. What do you do about the membership of the Conservative Party to the right if they're literally dying off? What's a policy platform that looks attractive to rebuild that membership? You're in charge, Danny, now. You're advising whoever is the leader. What are you going to tell them to do?
You've probably made your first big mistake, which is you put me in charge, right? It's very possible. It's something I'm thinking about considering the whole time, which is that the way that the Conservative Party might create its robust coalition is a coalition which I'm not part of. And that is a decision for the Conservative Party. If you put me in charge, and I'll tell you, I would obviously orientate the Conservative Party back towards competence in the centre. I would make a pitch for the long-term future of the Conservative Party being as a party of open, rather than a party of closed. I think you can do that from a moderate position. You don't have to throw yourself immediately into saying, right, well, that means we have to reverse Brexit or anything. I think you can take that view, and I would seek to persuade any leader of the Conservative Party that they'd probably win back votes from Reform and from the Liberal Democrats and Labour simply by showing that they could govern the country in a sensible and intelligent way, and that they're a potential Prime Minister. So I would urge them to be an alternative government rather than merely an opposition. I think they won't take that advice, and it's possible that maybe it's not even good advice. Maybe the right advice is to say, well, Labour and the Liberal Democrats could be one party, and we'll be, we'll work with Reform by letting Labour and the Liberal Democrats have the kind of moderate free market position, and we'll become economic populists with Reform. Possibly.
I mean, I think on the question of the membership, and obviously something, again, I'm very interested in. I'm not sure it's true to say it's completely dying out. I mean, it is true that it is quite old. The last survey we did after the 2019 election, I think it was about 40% of Conservative members were over the age of 65 from memory. So, they are getting older, clearly, but there are some young people joining. And if you go to Conservative Party conference, you will see an awful lot of very keen young people, although whether that will drop off if the party is in opposition and seen to be a hopeless case, that's something else to consider. But I mean, it is very, very difficult for parties to take any kind of positive action that encourages people to join them, because, quite frankly, it's not something that many people get into doing. The one thing that seems to work is have a particularly radical, inspiring leader that brings people flocking into the party. But of course, a radical, inspiring leader is not necessarily, as we saw with Jeremy Corbyn, what a party needs in order to get itself elected. So there could be, if you like, a big trade-off or disjunction between, on the one hand, the kind of thing that would make the Conservative Party a kind of mass membership organisation, again, in as much as any party can be anymore, on the one hand, and on the other, a strategy to get it back into government. I think that would be actually quite difficult to do. So I suspect what will happen is that the membership will, shrink over time, and stabilize at a certain point, because I think there's always a kind of minimum number of people, it seems to me, who quite like the process of politics and are attracted to it for all sorts of social reasons. So I don't think it'll die completely, but I think it is a problem. And of course that then gets us into this question of whether in some ways part of the Conservative Party's problems stem from the fact that under William Hague, and this is not a criticism of Danny at all, they decided to open up the choice of leader, at least in terms of the final say on that question, to their membership, a membership which is pretty unrepresentative, both demographically and ideologically, of the country as a whole.
So, looking at events across the Channel, what does that tell us about what the shape of our politics might be over the next few years? Is the French situation just totally different because there's a different French system, or are we heading down the same route?
Well, can I just jump? I'll just jump in there, because I think we're very tempted often to make or draw parallels between the UK and the US, and we look at what's happened to the Republican Party and say, oh, there, but for the grace of God, go the Conservatives. But I think also actually what's happened to the Republicans in France is a very good illustration of what happens if you as a centre-right party begin to go too far down the kind of populist radical right road in order to try and head off a far-right party. And that's what happened to Les Républicains really since Sarkozy and his successors. And in the end, what happens is that you simply raise the salience of the issues that actually attract support for the far right, and you don't do yourself that much good, because people tend to prefer the original to the copy. And I do fear if the Conservative Party carries on down the road it's travelled recently, that the same thing could happen.
Danny, what do you think of the lessons?
What, of Macron, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I basically suggested there are kind of two strategies for dealing with these sort of radical right views about globalization, and that one is, I suppose, confrontation, which you might call the Macron strategy, and the other is what you might call the Cameron strategy, which is okay, I can't agree with you completely, but I understand your point. Let's try and deal with your problems individually, right? So Macron's basic view is this is the problem of the radical right is more their kind of whole way of viewing the world, everything from women's rights to corporal punishment to the euro, and there's no way that I can deal with that by taking off each of these individual items. It's more a mood that I'm dealing with. So I'm going to tackle it head on. I'm going to say this mood is not French. And I've always wondered about whether that would be such a good strategy. David Cameron's strategy, which was, okay, well, you've got some real things. And I know this, I know this was the case. I remember having a conversation with him about the referendum on the Europe. And one of the things that he said to me is, I also think it's right, Danny, right? These people have got a point, and I think it's reasonable for them to have a referendum, right? And I'm sure nobody had thought that that was part of his thinking, but it was. But of course, we know where that led. So he got defeated on that, and it ended up with him losing power. So both of these strategies are really problematic. It's difficult, and I'm not sure which of them is right. I think the only real strategy for dealing with the rise of kind of nationalist and closed feelings is to make international capitalism work for everyone, and that means trying trying to exclude as few people as possible from the benefits of growth. And you can see the growth of these kind of movements coincides with the, and the places where it happens. I mean, if you wanted to go to a place that really represents the kind of crumbling disaffection of a sort of angry Britain, you'd go to Clacton, and that's what's happening.
I mean, I agree with Danny. There is no magic bullet. I mean, if you look around centre-right parties all over Europe, they are struggling with that, threat on their national populist right, if you like. And as Danny said, out and out confrontation doesn't necessarily work, but nor does accommodation, for the reasons I've given. And I think it goes back actually to what Danny was saying about where a sensible Conservative Party would place itself strategically, and that is for centre-right parties to stress what historically they've been good at, which is pragmatic, competent management of an essentially capitalist economy, with a reasonable welfare safety net that means that people don't suffer too much when things go wrong. And I think if centre-right parties get dragged into the kind of anti-woke culture war stuff, they're onto a loser, because, as I say, in the end, that just means those issues get talked about, thought about, become top of head for people. And in that case, they tend not to trust a sort of, a centre-right Conservative or Christian Democrat or market liberal party to do those things. They trust the far right to do them.
But isn't that exactly where Starmer has just planted his flag very, very definitely? I mean, is there any space for a Conservative Party that is attempting to be competent, pro-growth, safety net?
The space is when and if Labour mess up, which they will eventually, because that's the way that government and politics tends to work. After all, for the most part, 20th century or post-war politics was about, to some extent, two fairly large parties, that had different ideological visions underpinning them, but were essentially fighting on those kind of valence or competence issues.
I want to ask a question before we split up. We focused on the opposition. Interestingly, I'm very struck by the fact that we've got all these polls now showing us with Labour on 400, 450 seats, and opposition parties, whichever ones they are, with less than 100 seats. We had a question in before we started from someone asking about mischief making in the Labour Party. And I was just struck by the fact that there's going to be at least 100, 150, 200 MPs in the Labour Party who don't have a job. They don't really have anything to do. And they're 2-3 times as large as any one opposition party. We've talked about splits elsewhere, may not get formal split, but actually is the most likely opposition to this next government, part of this next government. Discuss.
Yeah, absolutely, completely nailed on point, and I think that's one of the reasons when I say the Labour Party hasn't decided where it is on their open close. That will be one of the rows. They've always had rows over whether you get what you might call the Preston model or the alternative economic strategy, however you want to put it. And although they've been quite careful to try to exclude too many campaign group candidates, they'll still get a group perhaps slightly more moderate building up of that kind, and I'm sure they will. So yes, that will be important in the next government. A lot of the critique and argument will have to come from Labour because they will dominate Parliament so much.
And of course, I think one thing that obviously Conservative Party parliamentarians will find is that there is just a lot less interest in them from journalists. The media, I mean, might not be true of Danny, but the media, generally speaking, after that leadership contest, which we presume will take place, probably won't pay a great deal of attention to the Conservative Party. They'll be far more interested in what's going on inside Labour for the reasons that Danny has very clearly given. I mean, I think, if you look at any party that comes into government, and has a reasonable sized majority, then there will be people who feel left out and feel aggrieved, and for either genuine or slightly faux ideological reasons, will start kicking off and kicking back against that government. Indeed, one of the reasons I would suggest why there was some pressure, at least on David Cameron, on Europe from his own MPs, was because there were quite a few people who had expected to get jobs, not even big jobs necessarily, in the Conservative government after 2010, who were denied them because, of course, they had to do a deal with the Liberal Democrats, and therefore people were kind of left out and left at a slightly loose end, if you like. And one way of kicking against the pricks was on Europe.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Danny, so.
I'm sure that's right, and I think it's going. And by the way, on the point about dealing with Labour, I've been amazed at how late in the day it's struck people that they ought to become more interested in what Labour's doing, because they're so interested in the Conservatives. But and you mentioned me. I'm sure I will take an interest in the Conservative Party, but I'm certainly, part of my focus has been to return to lots of the kind of thinking about social democracy I've done for years, because that's where all the stories and intellectual arguments and action's going to be in the next few years.
And that's, Danny, where I think you're perhaps unduly pessimistic about the potential role that the Liberal Democrats could play, because I think you're right in your description of what they've done in this election, and it's probably right. We're just not the Conservatives in this particular constituency, but I think very quickly they'll need to find a voice and a role. And as you yourself say, it's a position in which they are the party of open. And I think your assumption that that's the Labour Party is necessarily also a party of open is not necessarily the case.
Well, it might not be that they could. So yeah, I'm saying that I think it's possible that Liberal Democrats could emerge as I guess the centre right party in those circumstances, if you were to choose that position. But the position of the Liberal Democrats has been kind of high taxes and higher social spending and kind of very, very liberal positions on national security and those kind of things that I'm not think would suit you that well to that. But I'd be delighted, obviously, if that's the position you wanted to take, since it's a position I am generally in favour of.
So does that mean we can see Danny Finkelstein's career go full circle and return to his centrist roots?
So look, let me just finish by asking you both. I started by asking you, you wake up on 5th of July 2024, what do you expect to see? Wake up on the 5th of July 2029, I realise it doesn't quite work like this. What are you expecting to see? Are we sort of well into second phase Starmer? Have we seen more splits? What's going on?
Well, I wasn't as wise as Danny after the 2019 election, to be honest. I did think Labour would be out for quote unquote a decade, because I just didn't imagine that even Boris Johnson could mess up as badly as he did. I thought he would be kind of controlled by the people around him. So I might not be the best person to ask about that. I mean, given the volatility that we've seen in the electorate, which is obviously greater than it has been for quite some time. I don't think we can rule out the possibility of a return for the Conservatives or some sort of right-wing formation, but I suspect that Labour would have to mess up pretty badly, and I don't see Keir Starmer as being the kind of guy who will mess up that badly. But the problem for Labour obviously comes in getting growth and managing perhaps to raise additional tax revenue without annoying so many people in the public that it begins to act as a drag anchor on its popularity.
Danny, I can see you nodding. Or
yeah, I mean, I agree. I basically agree with that analysis. I think the problem for the Conservative Party will be trying to present at the next general election any kind of alternative government, and one that's, you know, led by attractive people who don't represent risky change. Even if Labour doesn't succeed in being able to fight Britain's on the right track, don't turn back, and it's possible they'll muck up so they can't do that, they would still be able to fall back on it's better the devil you know, because the Conservative Party is unlikely to position itself in the way that Starmer did, where he cut off even that. The Tory Party looked more eccentric and was less the devil, you know, there's the devil agent one. I can't see who the figures are in the Conservative Party who are going to produce that change. I think the Conservative Party is quite confused about what to do about reform, and almost certainly will elect a leader who will then double up on kind of woke issues, which seem eccentric, and is really just punting the issue of what the Conservative Party is actually going to become while talking about marginal issues. So I just don't. I don't think the Conservative Party. I don't feel the same as I did about Labour after 2019, but that does depend a lot on how well Labour resolves its own issues, and obviously on external things. One of the reasons why the Conservative Party is going to do so badly is because of COVID, right? Which completely tanked the economy, and therefore they're not able to run on Britain's on the right track, don't turn back. So,
brilliant. Look, thank you so much. I can't believe we're sort of through an hour in that time. That was really, really fascinating, and you know, I hope we can continue this discussion. Perhaps we should return to at least some of it after the election and see what's come true and where we think that might mean things shake out. Only falls now for me to say, I mean, huge thank you to Danny and Tim. I know how busy you are at the moment. That was a great discussion. If people are coming to Radix Big Tent for the first time, this is the last of our election webinars, but after the summer, we're looking forward to helping launch Professor John Kay's book, looking at corporate system. That should be good, so watch this space. If you've enjoyed this discussion, Radix is funded by individual members of the public, and we're happy to disclose always who we are, but we'd rather like you to be one of them. So do think about whether you can make a donation via our website, which you'll see in the chat. Let's not all hold our breath for the 4th of July, but keep an eye out and see whether any of these predictions come true. Thank you so much to everybody for your time. That was absolutely fantastic, and I will see you again soon. Take care.